Mark Ronson, musician and producer, has been behind some of the biggest hits of the past 20 years. Working with an incredible roster of artists, Mark has consistently managed to help bring out their soulful best, delving into the very essence of their artistry to create career-defining records. From Amy Winehouse, Queens of the Stone Age, Lady Gaga, Paul McCartney and Miley Cyrus, Mark has traversed genres, maintaining an integral creative influence on everything he works on. This is the story of his career highlights and key recording and production techniques that we can all use in our own recordings. Mark started his life in London, born to British parents Anne Dexter and Lawrence Ronson, who at the time was a music manager and publisher. They eventually split when Mark was 5 years old, and the family subsequently moved to New York. While in New York, Mark's mother met foreigner guitarist Mick Jones, and they eventually married. As a result, Mark was immersed in the 80s music scene that his new stepdad inhabited, with regular visits from stars such as Mick Jagger. Mark also had access to his musical instruments. He remembers at age 11 being shown the synclavier, and then later recreating his favourite song at the time, Terence Trent D'Arby's Wishing Well. It's fair to say that he got the bug for music and soon took up the guitar, later playing in bands, getting gigs around New York. Into his teenage years, Mark was becoming more drawn to hip-hop, saying it was practically the soundtrack of the city, as you heard it everywhere. This led him to putting down the guitar and buying some turntables to try his hand at DJing. And to be a good DJ, you needed good records. This meant crate digging for hours on end, and getting up early to go to record fairs. But the obsession paid off, as his name grew throughout the hip-hop club scene. It wasn't long before Mark started to be hired for the biggest parties and mixing it with the hip-hop royalty of the day. One of his main calling cards was fusing funk, hip-hop and rock and roll into his set lists. This may not seem unusual now, but back in the late 90s it was unique and attracted the attention of hip-hop's big names like P. Diddy, Jay-Z and Q-Tip. Purely based on his DJing taste, he was asked if he wanted to help produce the Australian artist Nika Costa. The fusion of hip-hop and rock was the idea, and it seemed to work great on the track Like a Feather, hitting that spot perfectly. The initial buzz surrounding the album was building with heavy rotation on MTV, and Mark was gearing himself up for success. But, unfortunately, he was about to receive his first lesson on Don't Believe the Hype. The album wasn't a commercial success, but it did earn him industry respect with his ability to create fresh sounds, and to the extent that Elektra Records offered him a deal to create a solo record with a budget that would allow him to bring in his favourite artists to collaborate with. These included Sean Paul, Mos Def, Daniel Merriweather, Q-Tip, Nate Dogg and Ghostface Killah. The track Oh We was perhaps the most notable commercially, although the album Here Comes the Fuzz didn't bring that much commercial success, especially given the cost of the whole project. Inevitably, this led to Mark being dropped by the label, and after 2 unsuccessful albums, left him considering whether the music business was really for him. During this period, he carried on DJing and creating music for various projects. One of these was creating a cover of Radiohead's Just, putting a completely new funk slant on the song and a 60s style horn section. The next record was going to follow on with this idea and feature reimagined cover versions with different artists. And during this process, he was introduced to Lily Allen and Robbie Williams, later contributing to their albums as producer. Another young artist that was suggested to him at the time was Amy Winehouse. Mark liked Amy's previous work and was keen to impress her when she was visiting him in New York. In their initial meeting, Amy said that she really liked the Motown feel of 60s girl groups and the Phil Spector wall of sound approach, which gave Mark some ideas to work with. With Amy due to fly back to the UK the next day, Mark was under pressure to give something to her before she left and stayed up all night coming up with ideas. One of those ideas featured a piano line and kick drum part mixed with a touch of spring reverb. Amy loved the idea and quickly started writing a melody and lyric. She also swiftly changed her travel plans and stayed another 2 weeks. Another classic song they came up with together was the huge hit Rehab, that again features this 60s retro sound that some confuse to be comprised of samples, although they were actually played in a studio by real musicians. A revelation in what was sonically possible came when Mark heard the Dap Kings records. They genuinely sounded like they could have been recorded in the 60s, or contained samples from those records, although these sounds had just been recorded that year not far from his New York home. Wanting to get some authentic horn sounds for his Versions album, Mark visited the Daptone studio, and not only got his horns recorded, but importantly received a huge education in recording techniques. At first glance, the studio may seem to be a vintage museum, but the equipment wasn't necessarily curated that way, and a lot of it was pure luck, as they picked up gear as it became available. For instance, the Ampeg Gemini guitar amps were rescued from a dumpster, and along with the classic microphones like the RCA DX77, they also used the very modern, at the time, Rode NT1A. This highlights how the right microphone is the right one no matter the cost or vintage. Each mic is capable of bringing out an artist's voice in a different way, and some can really connect with the voice, inspiring the singer to reach new heights. Part of getting a vintage sound is inevitably recording to tape, and there's a key step that helps keep the sound tight. Daptones engineer Gabriel Roth explains, "I'll roll some low end off the tracks around 80 to 100 Hz before they get to tape. The lowest frequencies have the most energy, and they saturate the tape before the rest of the sound has a chance to get the benefit of nice tape distortion. This lets the distortion take place closer to the upper range of the sound and keeps it tight. I'll put the low end back during the mix if necessary." Mark recorded the majority of his production contributions at the Daptones studio using these traditional methods, even recording drums with just one microphone. This technique is great for a vintage sound, and here's a picture of the setup that Homer Steinweiss had for the records. Just one Shure 55 pointed at the middle of the snare body, about halfway in front of the kick drum head. The album was a massive success and thrust both Amy and Mark into the limelight, and he became the hit producer of the day, working with artists like Adele, the Kaiser Chiefs, and one of his boyhood favourites, Duran Duran. The Versions album that came out the following year after Back to Black was also a big success, and featured Amy singing the Zootons song Valerie, again with a 60s style approach. The years following this period were busy for Mark, including working with Bruno Mars for his Unorthodox Jukebox album, and even the great Paul McCartney. Having refused payment for DJing one of McCartney's parties, Mark cheekily invited Paul to collaborate instead. At the time, McCartney was working on his 2013 album New. He was undecided on who he wanted to produce the project, and decided to try on Mark, Giles Martin, Ethan Johns and Paul Epworth before picking one. However, in the end, Macca decided to work with all four, with Mark working on the songs New and Alligator. His next major solo album, Uptown Special, carried on the collaborative theme and featured an impressive lineup of artists that included Bruno Mars, Kevin Parker, Jeff Basker, and one of his big heroes, Stevie Wonder. The track, Uptown's First Finale, contains a harmonica part that Mark had sent to Stevie in hope that he might record it for him. But having not heard anything for months, he gave up on the idea until one day he was contacted to say Stevie had recorded it and it was on its way. Mark said, "When I first heard it, it was one of the most emotional experiences I've ever had. I was dumbfounded and speechless. I still can't believe that somewhere in a studio in Chicago one night, Stevie Wonder actually recorded a piece of music that I wrote. I've listened to it 100 times and it still messes me up when I play it." The album is most famous for the track Uptown Funk. Mark said it was a rare instance when one of his hit songs came from a place of pure joy as opposed to melancholy. It came from a jam with Bruno Mars playing drums, Mark on bass, and Jeff Basker playing synths. From this initial jam, the song actually took 7 months to complete, and Mark recalls the famous main hook was one of the last parts to be added. It was pretty much finished when Bruno suggested it, and Mark wasn't impressed. But instead of dismissing it immediately, he decided to sleep on the idea. Waking up the next day, it became clear that it was a great idea and in fact it should be the main hook. This highlights an instance of not being too quick to dismiss an idea, especially when you're very close to the piece of music. A great skill when collaborating, of course. In 2016, Mark began work on Lady Gaga's very personal album Joanne. The title song was born from an arpeggiated guitar part that Mark had played her in their initial writing sessions. This represents a departure from Gaga's normal style, but she trusted his direction, as he did his thing of creating a sonic world for the artist to be inspired in and try a different approach. One person who was a big fan of Uptown Funk was Josh Homme's son, who kept playing it to his dad, who eventually became a fan also. This then led to Josh contacting Mark to ask if he'd like to work on their album Villains. The idea was to get a fresh perspective, and also to assist Homme, who was normally in charge of production duties, and allow him to just be a singer and guitarist. Sonically, Josh was interested in getting a tight sound, and in his words, something that sounded like it had the air sucked out from it. Mark was a big fan of the band, and was thrilled to be asked to work with them, stating, "Queens are and have always been my favourite rock and roll band, ever since I walked into Tower Records on Sunset and bought Rated R in the summer of 2000's. So it was incredibly surreal to be welcomed into their secret pirate clan, or the Jacuzzi as Josh likes to call it. I also knew that my super fandom alone wouldn't keep me in the Jacuzzi. There were moments during the making of the album in which I was aware I was watching my musical heroes craft something that was sure to be one of my favourite moments on any Queen's album, and to have some part in that felt like a dream, a very heavy, dark, wonderful dream." Mark was also working with Lady Gaga again for the soundtrack to the film A Star Is Born, which was a massive success, earning an Oscar for the pair for Best Original Song. Following the breakup of his marriage in 2017, he embarked on his next record, which would become his breakup album, Late Night Feelings. The standout track from this album was his collaboration with Miley Cyrus for the song Nothing Breaks Like a Heart. Mark was impressed by her vocal prowess, but also the speed of her writing. The first day she came in, she recorded the chorus and wrote the verses. Uptown Funk took 7 months to write, so I was so overjoyed to have something that felt so special. Mark has never seemed to rest on his laurels, with the Barbie movie soundtrack just being one of the projects he's worked on this year alone. One reoccurring attribute he has that convinces so many artists to trust him is his ability to be politely honest while maintaining an enthusiasm for ideas. And over the years, he's managed to soak in all these influences through his collaborations and learn lessons from each one. Being humble is a great creative frame of mind, as it allows the best decisions to be made and allows the artist to feel comfortable enough to express themselves to the fullest. I'm sure there'll be plenty more to come from Mark Ronson, and I, for one, will be keeping an ear out.